Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Intern's Oddities from around the world. So, first off, I would like to apologize. I'm a few days late here. I don't really have a good excuse. I just got really exhausted with work and I went to bed and didn't have time. That's my excuse, and I apologize for that. So, I'm doing it today, and I will do my best to do better in the future. I apologize. So, today I'm going to expand upon death rituals. There were so much more that we could have discussed on that. And so I'm going to get a little bit deeper into some of that stuff. So, I wanted to start with the soap lady who was covered in Autopsy. So, my source for this is um, a YouTube video, SYMHC Classics, The Lady Who Turned to Soap, Stuff You Missed in History Class. That is my source for this information. So, the Soap Lady was part of the Mutter Museum collection in Philadelphia, along with other corpses that saponified as they decomposed. They exhumed a body from a cemetery and found a layer of adipocere, otherwise known as grave wax, which is basically a soap-like substance which will form on bodies under the right conditions. There is supposedly a soap man at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, as well as the soap lady in Philadelphia. They were not the only two soap bodies exhumed, though, as in the late 1700s in Paris, bodies of children were exhumed from the Cemetery of Innocents to be moved into what would later become the Paris Catacombs. This was the first time on record we have people noting adipocere on bodies. Now, later on, scientists Antoine Fursoy and Michel Choi were studying the decomposition in those bodies when they noticed that several of them were coated in a thin, waxy substance, and they named this substance adipocere upon this discovery. Adipocere forms on rare occasions as part of the decomposition process, but the proper conditions are very rare and most bodies will never do this. The corpse wax starts off like soft paste or putty, but it hardens over time into something like hard wax or damp mortar. The whole process is called personification, and it slowly encases the body in wax, thus stopping the decaying process. It can happen in damp soil or water as long as the environment is low on oxygen. In some testing, the process started within just a few days, or it could stretch into more than a year. Warm water will hasten the process, most common in people with high body fat. Soap Man and Soap Lady had water seeping into their caskets, which would provide the perfect environment for saponification. According to rumors, Soap Lady had been an elderly, obese woman who had passed away in 1792 from yellow fever, and this story persisted until the 1980s. However, in the 1980s, a team of researchers, including Gerald J. Conlogue and his two students, came to do some studying on the body. And when they did, they took some x-rays and found out Soap Lady had been younger than 40 at her time of passing. They also determined that she had been short. Soap Man, acquired in 1958, had also has also seen studies and examined by the Smithsonian and determined to have been in his 40s at the time of his passing, when previously thought to have been in his 60s. So they were off by about 20 years until they came back later and examined it with new information and new technology. So that's pretty interesting. They literally, this is going to sound kind of morbid, but a long time ago, they would sometimes make soap, like natural bars of soap. Sometimes they would be made with corpses. So think about that the next time you're washing your hands with a like a bar of soap. Think about that and wonder to yourself, is this actually human remains? Just something strange to consider. you know. And I've always found it fascinating to see the way that different cultures around the world experience the death and the afterlife and how they cope with all this stuff. Like Dia de los Muertos in, Mexican culture, and they celebrate the dead and, try to keep the memory of their loved ones alive. And that's a big part of that. We're going to get into that here in a minute. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about candles made from grave wax. Yeah, they used to make candles from the greasy, waxy-like substance that formed on corpses under certain conditions. That was the thing that happened. So, my source for this one was Chat GPT. I asked Chat GPT, do people really make candles using Autopsy? And here's what they told me. Historically, yes, candles made from Autopsy, also known as corpse wax, have been documented, but they're extremely rare and morbid in nature. You know how I love my morbid facts. Autopsy is the waxy, soap-like substance that can form during the decomposition of a body in moist, anaerobic, low oxygen conditions. It's primarily made of fatty acids and has a somewhat waxy consistency, which led to historical rumors or legends about its use in candle making. Now for the historical context. During the 18th and 19th centuries, there were claims that human fat, sometimes even from executed criminals, was used in candles or soap, especially in folklore and Gothic literature. In places like Europe during wartime or in catacombs, some stories suggest that fat from the dead may have been repurposed, but these are usually anecdotal or exaggerated. I don't think YouTube allows that word, so I'm not sure how to word it, but let's just call them bad guys. The bad guys. Does this help? They aren't exactly good at seeing things. I'm trying to get the point across without getting us in trouble by YouTube. So the bad guys that couldn't see that well were falsely accused of making soap or candles from humans, which has been debunked as propaganda through the myth where it kind of jumped on me. Sorry, hold up. Okay. Though the myth persists. So this, according to Chat GPT, they were accused of it, but it was a myth. Now, in modern times, today, no one legitimately uses Autopsy for candle making, as it would be illegal, unethical, and a violation of human remains, obviously. It would also be unreliable since Autopsy is not consistent or easy to harvest, extremely disturbing from a societal and moral standpoint. Of course. So, while it has a grain of historical truth, using Autopsy for candles is mostly the stuff of legend, horror fiction, or extreme cases of macabre curiosity. And then they gave me some examples of where this had occurred throughout history. A famous fictional and semi-historical example comes from the 18th and 19th century Europe, particularly tied to grave robbing and body snatching, when rumors circulated that tallow candles made from human fat were used by criminals and even in occult practices. Here's a couple of notable examples. First off, the legend of the Hand of Glory. For context, this was about European folklore, especially from France and England. And it is, a hand of glory is a severed hand from a hanged man, supposedly dried and used by thieves. According to the legend, the fingers were lit like candles, or sometimes a candle made from human fat was placed in the hand. I've heard of this one before. It is said to render people motionless or asleep while a burglary took place. And while not named explicitly, the recipe for the candle in these legends often includes the fat of a hanged man, very similar to Autopsy if taken from an actual decomposed body. The Paris catacombs and cemetery exhumations in the 18th century is another good example. In the late 1700s, Paris exhumed and relocated remains from overcrowded cemeteries to the catacombs. Now, the rumor is that during this period, there were dark rumors that rendered fat from exhumed bodies was used to make candles and soap, especially during times of scarcity. And the credibility. While there's no solid proof this was done systematically, it's plausible that isolated incidents occurred or that these stories arose as a reflection of the public's horror at corpse handling. And there are also a few examples within Gothic literature, such as Penny Dreadful and Sweeney Todd. Now, these were fictional stories set in Victorian England, often used themes of body horror and cannibalistic or necromantic practices. In some of these tales, like Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, one of my favorite stories. I love that one. We could do an episode on that one day. That'd be a good episode. Sorry. Human remains were repurposed for meat pies. They were basically cannibals. And he would people would come into his barber shop for a shave, and he'd give them a shave, all right. A really close shave. But anyways, Now, other tales hinted at candles made from fat, adding to the macabre ambiance. So, while the actual use of Autopsy for candle making is rare to non-existent, according to Chat GPT, folklore and dark fiction definitely played with the idea, sometimes blurring the line between truth and terrifying myth. And then we got an autopsy. Now we're going to go talk about autopsies and how that works. So my source for this was also Chat GPT, and I asked it to describe the process of an autopsy to me. So an autopsy, also called a post-mortem examination, is a detailed and systematic investigation of a body after death to determine the cause and manner of death, assess disease or injury, and sometimes for legal or educational purposes. Below is an in-depth, step-by-step breakdown of the autopsy process as conducted by a forensic pathologist or medical examiner. So, stage 1 are the preliminary steps. Authorization and documentation. Legal authority must be obtained through consent in hospital autopsies or jurisdiction in forensic autopsies. A case history is reviewed: age, sex, medical records, circumstances of death, photographs of the body, in situ if necessary, and any identifying marks are taken. External evidence like clothing, medical devices, or foreign objects are preserved. Body receipt. The body arrives in a sealed bag or wrapped in a sheet. It is tagged with identifying information, name if known, case number, and the date and time. A preliminary external examination is performed and recorded. External examination. The body is placed on a stainless steel autopsy table with drainage features. The height, weight, and body condition, musculature, decomposition, rigor mortis are documented. All visible injuries, abrasions, bruises, lacerations, burns are photographed and measured. Body surfaces are examined under UV light for biological stains or residues. Tattoos, scars, needle marks, or surgical sites are recorded. The orifices, such as the mouth, nostrils, ears, anus, genitalia, are inspected for trauma, discharge, or foreign material. And then they continue to the internal examination, the Y-shaped incision. A Y-shaped incision is made from each shoulder down to the xiphoid process, the bottom of the sternum, then straight down the midline to the pubic bone. Skin and soft tissue are peeled back to reveal the chest wall and abdominal cavity. Rib cage opening. The sternum is cut with rib shears or an electric saw, and the chest plate is lifted away. The organs are exposed, such as the lungs, heart, great vessels, diaphragm, liver, stomach, and intestines. Organ removal. Rocket stat. This is a hard word for me. Hold on. Rokitansky. Rokitansky method often used. I apologize for that. Organs are removed en bloc as one mass or individually. A systematic dissection is done. Each organ is weighed, photographed, and cut open. Pathologist checks for hemorrhage, necrosis, tumors, emboli, infections, or congenital defects. Brain examination. A scalp incision from ear to ear, or a coronal cut, is made and the scalp is reflected forward and backward. The skull cap, calvarium, is removed with a saw. The brain is inspected in situ, removed, weighed, and sectioned after fixation in formalin. Additional investigations. Toxicology samples are collected, such as blood from the heart and femoral vein, urine, bile, vitreous humor from the eye, stomach contents, and the liver. Histology samples are taken from all major organs and any lesions. Tissues are fixed, embedded, sliced, stained, and examined under a microscope. Microbiology or virology swabs may be taken from lungs, meninges, or other sterile sites. Closure. After all examinations, organs may be returned to the body cavity or retained, depending on jurisdiction or consent. The body is then sutured closed. The chest and abdomen are sewn up with a thick suture in a baseball stitch pattern. The scalp is reapproximated and stitched if the brain was examined. The body is cleaned thoroughly and prepared for release to the funeral home. Reporting. A preliminary autopsy report is written within 24 to 72 hours. A final autopsy report, including toxicology and histology findings, may take weeks. The report includes the cause of death, manner of death, and contributory conditions, observations, and diagnostic conclusions. And that is the process of an autopsy. And now to close us out for today, we're going to finish up today with the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. And this one has always been pretty interesting to me. I've never really looked deep into it before, but I've always enjoyed it casually, you know? Grim Fandango was a game that I played when I was younger on the computer back in the 90s, I think it was. It was one of those adventure games on the computer. And anyways, it had this dude and he was a skeleton and he worked for a travel agency in the land of the dead. And okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting on a rant here. But anyways, my point is it was a really cool game that had a lot of references to Dias de los Muertos that I didn't realize, and I kind of realized it, but once I started looking into this, I realized how deep it really was, and I can actually appreciate the game even more now that I know this stuff about the culture. So, it's Hispanic culture, obviously, and some people call it Celebration de la Vida. In 2015, James Bond, Spectre, you can see James Bond striding through a Day of the Dead festival in Mexico City. When this movie was made, Mexico had never held a parade like this before. That's interesting because I feel like they've celebrated this for a long time, but maybe this was like an over-the-top parade. Maybe it was more respectful before, or not respectful, that's not the word I'm looking for. More private, maybe? I'm not really sure on that. But that's what my source said, and my source was a YouTube video titled, What is Day of the Dead? So let's continue. When this movie was made, Mexico held its very first Day of the Dead parade 1 year after the release of the movie, so that would have been in 2016. Dias de los Muertos is celebrated November 1st and November 2nd and is meant as a time for honoring the deceased. This combines indigenous death rituals with Catholic practice. Many indigenous people thought it extremely important that they venerate and honor their ancestors. That's also a very common Chinese and Asian belief as well. So I can appreciate that. There's a wide range of beliefs amongst the indigenous peoples of Mexico, including the Maya and the Mixtec. In pre-Hispanic era, ancestors would be called upon for advice or even just respected with increase as well as offerings. Incense as well as offerings. I'm sorry about that. Before the Spanish conquest, the Aztecs dedicated most of the month to Mictecatl. Uh, Mictecacihuatl. Mictecacihuatl. I'm sorry, I know I butchered that. I tried. I did my best. I'm sorry. In Aztec mythology, she provided over the underworld with her husband and is often depicted as a skeletal figure. In Mexico, attitudes towards the deceased are different compared to many Western cultures, as they don't just let go of the deceased, but go out of their way to remember them. Some people even believe that it is not honored properly. If not honored properly, the spirits could haunt them or bring bad luck. Visiting a cemetery is most common, where you can clean and bring offerings, such as bread. Bread is a good thing to bring. They will often consist of a photo of the deceased surrounded by their favorite objects, which are given as ofrendas. Children and infants typically receive candy, toys, tamales, and other such foods. Sugar skulls, ooh, this is one of my favorite parts, known as calaveras de azúcar, also celebrated the deceased. They are inscribed with the name of a deceased one and placed on altars and eaten as a reminder that death is not the bitter end, but rather a sweet continuation of the natural cycles of life. I love that part. That is absolutely beautiful. It's like, hey, we know you lost someone, but it's not the end. It's actually sweet for them because they get to move on. They don't have to suffer anymore. They don't have to feel any pain. They get to feel the sweet release, the sweet knowledge of what comes after. For certain, they don't have to take it on faith anymore. They get to know. And, you know, there is a positive lining to everything, and we have to do our best to remember that. I've never had a sugar skull, but I would love to try one. Now, pan de muerto, or bread of the dead, is also given to the dead and eaten by the living at grave sites in particular to commemorate the dead. Now we get into a little pop culture here. Coco made $800 million, making it the biggest movie in Mexico history. And some people even accuse the movie of being a ripoff of an earlier 2014 movie called The Book of Life. The Book of Life is about La Muerte, which is a mashup of skeletal dame La Catrina and Santa Muerte, the folk saint we discussed during our main death rituals episode. Many urban Mexican people today celebrate by dressing up in Mexican-inspired neo-goth clothing and going out to party, where the rural folk will put on their traditional repeal, engage in solemn processions, and they see the event as melancholic, but with a bit of joy as well. So basically, if you live in the city, you would probably dress up and go out and party. But if you live in the country, you're probably just going to stay home and, have a solemn occasion and, remember the dead and maybe say some prayers for them. And they will also have mariachi bands playing the recently deceased's favorite music in the country areas. They have also incorporated Santa Muerte into the Day of the Dead rituals to the point where the Mexican Catholic Church now issues annual warnings to their followers in the days leading up to the celebration, warning them to keep Santa Muerte out of All Souls and All Saints' Day because the religious leaders view the skeleton saint as a heretical abomination. La Catrina, also known as the Skeletal Dame, is often confused with Santa Muerte, but is becoming more popular. She first appeared as a piece of satire drawn by José Guadalupe Posada, who is considered the father of Mexican printmaking in 1910. Posada lived under the rule of dictator Porfirio Diaz, who ruled for 31 years and was known for his oppressive regime. La Catrina was created to mock the ruling classes for letting many of their citizens starve to death while they lived lavishly. Originally drawn as a skeleton wearing a large hat, La Catrina was intended to be a likeness of the dictator's wife. La Catrina eventually became popular iconography during the Mexican Revolution as well, which leads to an increased appreciation for the indigenous past. The intended message of La Catrina is a reminder that no matter your power, money, or social status, nobody escapes death forever. And that is what I have for you today. I apologize that I was a few days late. Again, I'm very sorry. I will do my best to work on that. And until next time, stay